My name is Maorong Jiang, and I'm the director of Creighton University's Asian World Center. Welcome to the forum, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, sponsored by the US Center for Citizen Diplomacy in partnership with Gallup and the World Affairs Councils of America. The Asian World Center is pleased to work with the US Center for Citizen Diplomacy to bring this event to Omaha and the Creighton campus. With support from our university president, vice presidents, deans, faculty colleagues, and students, the Asian World Center tries to serve as a small bridge across land and sea to bring different people, cultures, and political views together in an effort to make our world a better place. Most of us here, I would assume, do not yet have Facebook or MySpace. But a forum such as this is our Facebook and our space. Only it is more personal. Every citizen can be a diplomat. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, deans, and the president of the university. In particular, thanks to the University Public Relations Office and its Associate Director, Cindy Walkman. Thanks also to today's panelists, Professor Nasser Asharif, Professor Michael Kelly, and Mr. Othman Al-Thawadi, founder and president of Creighton's Saudi Student Association. On behalf of the Asian World Center at Creighton University, my thanks go to Anne Shadi and M. Jessica Rowe of the US Center for Citizen Diplomacy for working with the Asian World Center to bring this national forum to Creighton. Thanks to KIOS, Omaha's NPR station, and to other medium organizations for help in bringing this forum to a broad audience in Omaha and the American heartland. The event is being recorded by KIOS and videotaped by Creighton Creative Services. Lastly, thanks to our featured speaker, Ms. Dalia Mogahed, and to all of you here present for this event. A warm reception is to follow this forum on the second floor common area. Please join the reception in honor of our speakers and supporters and all of you, and continue the Q&A. Now, please welcome Anne Shadi, Executive Director of the US Center for Citizen Diplomacy, for her opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and certainly an honor for the U.S. Center to be present here at Creighton University. Its outstanding record of academic achievement and excellence is recognized worldwide. I want also to pay honor to the Asia World Center. I noticed when I walked into the hallway and picked up a brief flyer about the center that on May 12 there was, of course, as we all know, a horrendous earthquake in China. And literally a week and a half later, the Asia World Center at Creighton had already sent 3,000 medical supplies to help those people. Hats off. The U.S. Center was formed just 18 months ago, and it came out of a whole series across the country of community-based forums on citizen diplomacy. That being the ways in which Americans interface with the world as citizens, not our official diplomatic relationships and not the military, but that third, very powerful component of our foreign policy, which has always been recognized as an important way in which our country interfaces with the rest of the world. Out of those summits, there were identified a series of 7 or 8 serious concerns regarding the way in which Americans can and already are interfacing, from partner schools and third grade efforts for pennies for peace to the Peace Corps and everything in between. We have hundreds of thousands of Americans that are doing tremendous work with the rest of the world. But there are real concerns with some of that. One of them being that, in fact, we have an emerging need in this country to pay attention to helping all of us better understand our relationship and understanding with the Arab world as well as the world of Islam. We haven't done a very good job on that issue, and so the board of directors, in its first meeting in February in Des Moines of 2007, said the emerging need that we feel the center needs to address across the country is to join forces with many other organizations that are also working on that effort and strengthen the way in which that is being done, which has, of course, led us to supporting and working with the World Affairs Councils and Gallup in getting information about this very important piece of work that has been done by Gallup out to the grassroots, and not only being utilized by universities, think tanks, people in Washington, those who will certainly make good use of it. But this is the kind of information that we firmly believe that all Americans should be looking at and trying to understand. So therefore, we are now involved, and thanks here, this is our second forum. There will be 7 that will be taken across the country. And our other partner for the other 5 cities are the World Affairs Councils that are located in Missoula, Montana, and Springfield, Illinois, and in Naples, Florida, and all of that will go on in 2 more cities yet to be named. That gives you just a little background. And before I complete my remarks, I want to pay special note that one of our wonderful board members at the U.S. Center is here. She is an Iowa State Senator, Nancy Butker, lives in Harlan, and you know, it's a lot easier for her to come here than it is to go to Des Moines. Nancy, would you just rise? I'm looking for you. You got it. There she is right in front of me. We're certainly fortunate to have Gallup, a 70-year-old internationally recognized corporation based in Omaha and Washington, whose founder, George Gallup, by the way, was born in Jefferson, Iowa. George Gallup built the corporation, and many of you Omahans know this, with a commitment to the belief that polling gives a voice to the people so that they may be heard. Traditionally, Gallup provides extensive information on its research as a product. However, because of the importance and the significance of the data that has been revealed in their recent work, then, therefore, the World Poll, which was taken place over 6 years and never attempted by any research firm, they decided to sponsor and then fund a special project called the Muslim West Fact Initiative. This effort is reaching out way beyond Gallup's traditional base of corporations and governments and universities and other research organizations throughout the world to provide information on this timely topic so that more Americans and others worldwide may add to our understanding of Islam and the Muslim world. In addition to this series of public forums with the U.S. Center and the World Affairs Councils and Creighton, and last night in Des Moines, 2 other internationally based nonprofit organizations, The initiative is extending information about the poll via an extensive website, which you are all encouraged to enjoy, a book, which is being discussed tonight, whose author, Dalia Mogahed, is with us and will be, of course, our featured speaker. But beyond all of that, Dalia and her staff are also working with national and international media. They are conducting meetings with worldwide leaders, including appearances at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, the Brookings Institute, the Solia Foundation, Search for Common Ground at MIT, and none other than the Screenwriters Guild of America. Some brief ground rules for today. Dalia will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then Jessica Rowe, who is Director of Programs and Special Initiatives at the U.S. Center, will handle a Q&A session. And then following that, we open it all up first to specially invited guests who are just behind me, going to make their comments, and then opening it all up, of course, to all of the audience. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pio Jaskowitz, and Pio is the Associate Publisher for Gallup Press, and he will introduce Dalia. Thank you very much.
It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dalia Mogahed. Dalia is a senior analyst and executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, which is dedicated to providing data-driven analysis of the views of Muslim populations around the world. She's co-author of the book Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, which has received critical acclaim from various global thought leaders. Michael Scheuer, the former chief of the Bin Laden unit at the CIA, called Who Speaks for Islam a book Americans must read before time runs out. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, few books could be more timely. Noah Feldman, Harvard law professor and former advisor to Paul Bremer in Iraq, called it required reading. Dalia's analysis has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy Magazine, the Harvard International Review, and other academic and popular journals. Her audiences have included the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, the World Economic Forum, the Brookings Institution's U.S. Islamic World Forum, and she has discussed Gallup findings with a wide range of opinion leaders, including Tony Blair, Madeleine Albright, Newt Gingrich, Chuck Hagel, Jeffrey Sachs, Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, Queen Rania of Jordan, and others. Dalia is a member of Women in International Security, and she serves on the project on U.S. engagement with the global Muslim community, as well as on the Brookings Crisis in the Middle East Task Force. Dalia has an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering. Her master's degree in business administration is from the Graduate School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dalia Mogahed.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time and sacrificing your personal time to be with us today. I want to talk to you today about a very important topic. Before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about the mission that started the company that I represent, the Gallup organization. Of course, as you know, Gallup's operational headquarters are only a few blocks away, right here in Omaha. Gallup was founded by a man named George Gallup, whose core mission was to help people be heard. He said, if democracy is about the will of the people, that someone should go find out what that will is. He thought that leaders made better decisions when they knew the will of the people. And it was this simple premise that was the foundation on which Dr. Gallup built his organization, the Gallup organization, almost 70 years ago. And he was one of the first who developed a methodology to reap the wisdom of the people as a natural resource for the public good. We wrote this book to share what we've learned by listening to the voices of 1 billion Muslims, a community that has often been discussed but seldom heard, because we believe that today, 3/4 of a century later, Dr. Gallup's mission has never been more important. Our country was attacked on 9/11/2001 in a way that few could imagine or even believe. Shortly after, Osama bin Laden released a statement laced with religious rhetoric, praising the attacks. Since then, violence has grown exponentially as Muslims and non-Muslims alike continue to be victims of global terrorism. Terrorism has occurred in Morocco to Indonesia, from Madrid to London, and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq rage on. Is this evidence of an all-out clash between Muslims and the West? The vital missing piece among the many voices weighing in on this question, and there are certainly many, is the actual views of ordinary Muslims. With all that is at stake for the United States and Muslim societies, indeed for the entire world, the time has urgently come to democratize the debate. So who speaks for Islam, what 1 billion Muslims really think, is about this silenced majority. This book is the product of a mammoth multi-year Gallup research study. Between 2001 and 2007, Gallup conducted tens of thousands of hour-long face-to-face interviews with residents of more than 35 nations that are predominantly Muslim or have substantial Muslim populations. What you see here is a map of Tanzania, a developing nation with a poor infrastructure. In spite of extreme challenges conducting research in even the most difficult terrain, Gallup insists on getting as close to a random sample as possible, since our chief research officer often reminds us that only God can truly create a completely random sample. However, we do try to come as close as we humanly can. The red dots are called what are primary sampling units. They are actual locations of households we interviewed. As you can see, we don't just stick to easy-to-get-to urban centers or places that have well-developed roads. Our samples represent residents, young and old, educated and illiterate, men and women, and from urban and rural backgrounds. So one of the commitments that we at Gallup have is an extraordinarily strong dedication to rigorous methodology. And that same methodology, whether it's in the United States or Tanzania, must apply. There are polls, for example, and when they're released, you realize that they only went to a few urban centers and called it a nationwide poll. That's a little like asking only people in New York City and LA and calling that a representative sample of the United States. With the random sampling method that Gallup used, results are statistically valid within a plus or minus 3-point error. In English, that means our results are only 3% away had we asked every adult in the country. This is what a random sample actually gives you. In totality, we surveyed a sample representing more than 90% of the world's 1.3 billion Muslims, making this the largest, most comprehensive study of Muslim opinion ever done. This study is in fact just a small part of a much wider endeavor, the Gallup World Poll, where Gallup is giving a voice to the entire globe on issues of health, education, citizenship, and leadership. This colossal study is paid for entirely by Gallup. Gallup, as a for-profit commercial company, emphatically protects this independence by never accepting funding from any organization to do its polling. All our survey research, including, of course, the World Poll, is self-funded and therefore totally independent. We are therefore beholden to no one. As you can imagine, the only way to be sustainable is to create a business model around this endeavor. So we have subscribers to our full data set, similar to any other commercial research company. But because this information is so important, we published a book about the contemporary Muslim world based on our research as our contribution to the world. With the vast amounts of data that we collected, we started to mine that data and ask the tough questions that are being debated today. What motivates sympathy for terrorism? Is democracy compatible with Islam? What do women want? I think that's a question a lot of people are wondering. I'm not sure if I'll be able to completely answer it today. And then we allowed the data, not vocal extremists, experts, pundits, or politicians, to answer those questions. And let that data draw our picture. The product is the book, Who Speaks for Islam? Our data revealed far more than we could possibly cover in one book. But we wanted to include some of the most important insights. We uncovered a number of findings, but the most important was this. The conflict between Muslim and Western communities is far from inevitable. It is more about perceptions of policies than a clash of principles. However, until and unless decision makers listen directly to the people and gain an accurate understanding of this conflict, extremists on all sides will continue to gain ground. Today, I will touch upon some of the most important findings regarding Muslim-Western relations, and then I look forward to your questions. Now, one thing that's been discussed quite a bit is the idea of whether or not values around freedom and democracy are compatible. Is there a fundamental clash in values around democracy between Muslims and the West? So we looked at our research. When we asked an open-ended question to our respondents in majority Muslim countries, we simply asked them, what do you admire most about the West? And here's what we found. When we posed this question to Muslims around the world, a trend, the most frequent response was technology. The most admired thing about the West was technology. The second most admired was liberty and democracy. When we asked that same question of Americans, we got the same two responses, the same two top responses. And remember, this is an open-ended question, not a multiple choice exam where an infinite number of possibilities are available to people. Just to give you a flavor of what people said in their own words. A Saudi Arabian respondent said, freedom of the press and opinion and expression, also scientific advancement, was what they admired most about the West. In Iran, social justice and having access to nuclear power. Real democracy. In Pakistan, they said law is above all and everyone observes the law. And also their political system is transparent and they are following democracy in its true sense. Moroccan told us it was liberty and freedom and being open-minded with each other. We also asked a question about a constitution. If people were given the opportunity to draft their own constitution for a new country, what basic guarantees would they include? And so we asked about freedom of speech. And we defined it for people in case they didn't understand what it meant. We said it meant being able to say whatever you wanted about the political, social, and economic issues of the day. We found that strong majorities around the world said that they would include freedom of speech as a fundamental right in this theoretical constitution. You can see that Egyptians, 94%, similar to Americans at 97%, and all the percentages are strong majorities. We also asked people their dreams for the future. What we didn't hear, what people didn't say is, they didn't say their dream was to wage jihad, but instead we heard about getting a better job, better economic well-being and prosperity, and offering a better future for their children. We heard this from 70% of Indonesians and 54% of Iranians, for example. But Muslims wish to achieve this progress within their own religion and culture and either be preached to by the West or forced to adopt Western culture. So while admiring much about the West, they wish to achieve progress through their own culture and in their own way. Despite admiring much about the West, few said adopting Western values would help Muslims progress. Instead, among the statements most frequently associated with the Muslim world was attachment to spiritual and moral values would help people progress. However, this attachment should not be mistaken for a desire to be isolated from the West. In fact, eager to have better relations with the West was also among the statements most frequently associated with the Muslim world. In fact, residents of Muslim countries and Americans agree that greater interaction between Muslims and Western communities is more a benefit than a threat, which really underscores why the work that Anne is doing and the Asia Foundation is doing is so important. However, Muslims actually do not see the West, quote unquote, as monolithic. Their perception of different nations falls along policy, not cultural or religious lines. For example, while the United States and the United Kingdom are viewed negatively, views of France and Germany are neutral to positive. In fact, they are viewed as positively as are other Muslim majority countries. For example, 74% of Egyptians have unfavorable views of the United States, and 69% say the same thing about Britain. However, only 21% express this view of France, while 30% express this view of Pakistan. This issue becomes especially clear when we compare the United States to our neighbor to the north, Canada, which has been called, not by me, but by others, America without the foreign policy. Not sure how Canadians feel about that. For example, while 67% of Kuwaitis have unfavorable views of the United States, this percentage for Canada is 3%. what is perhaps most telling is when respondents are asked to associate different descriptors with different countries. And when you look at a weighted average across the entire database, we found that 70% of our respondents give the United States a descriptor of ruthless, while only 8% and 6% say the same about France and Germany. For many Muslims, the ruthless label is likely reflected in attitudes about the UK and US-led invasion of Iraq, which vast majorities say did more harm than good. Muslims clearly see the conflict as not with Western civilization as a whole, but instead with specific Western powers based on the negative perception of their policies, not their principles. Many Muslims around the world, while admiring Western values, believe that some Western powers do not live these values in their treatment of Muslims. For example, significant percentages of Muslims around the world do not believe the US is serious about democracy in their region. This is the view especially in countries where democratic promotion has been the loudest, such as Egypt and Pakistan. What Muslims say they admire most about the West, they in fact associate most strongly, specifically with the United States. That is, citizen liberties. Yet at the same time, they believe the US is denying Muslims these same rights of self-determination. Doubting American intentions with regard to democracy are closely tied with the perception that America is a hegemonic neo-colonial power that controls the region. More than 65% of Egyptians, Jordanians, and Iranians believe that the US will not allow people in their region to fashion their own political future as they see fit without direct US influence. To explain the deep gap between America's espoused values of democracy, human rights, and self-determination, on one hand, and its perceived treatment of Muslims on the other, Muslims turn to the belief that America and its allies must simply be hostile toward Islam and regard Muslims as inferior. The idea being that since the perceived way Muslims are treated is so antithetical to the admired Western values, these same Western powers must simply be singling Muslims out. So, not surprisingly, when we ask Muslims to tell us what the West can do to improve relations with the Muslim world, the most frequent response, whether we're asking people in Turkey or Saudi Arabia, Morocco or Indonesia, is for the West to demonstrate more respect and to regard Muslims as equals and not inferior. This is a respondent in Lebanon that just gives you an example of what we hear all around the world. The West should treat Muslims equally to improve their relations because they look down upon us. We asked a very direct question: do you believe the Western world respects the Muslim world? And found, probably not very surprising, large percentages of people, especially Palestinians, Egyptians, even Turks, Saudi Arabians, saying no. They did not think the Western world respected the Muslim world. What was somewhat of a surprise, though, was that the majority of Americans agreed. In fact, anti-Muslim sentiment is unfortunately widespread in the US. For example, Gallup asked this question, thinking very honestly about your feelings: how much prejudice, if any, do you feel toward the following religious groups? And here's what we heard when we asked about Jews. 74% claimed they had no prejudice, while the remainder said they had at least some prejudice, which shows us that anti-Semitism is unfortunately not yet a relic of the past. When we ask the same question about Muslims, only 34% said no prejudice, while the majority said at least some prejudice. An alarming 19%, nearly 1 out of 5, admitted to having a great deal of prejudice. In 2006, 26% of Americans said they had favorable views of Muslims, compared to 30% who said they had negative views, a net of a negative 4%, and among the most negatively viewed religious groups in the United States, only topping atheists and Scientologists. Now that was in 2006, where the net was negative 4. We asked the same question in 2008, in March to be exact. And if we look at what has happened between 2006 and 2008, there has not been another terrorist attack, and the violence in Iraq has actually improved, decreased because of the surge. So we might expect things to have gotten a bit better. But unfortunately, what we found is that in March of 2008, the net was a negative 17, where 17% of Americans said they had favorable views of Muslims, and 34% said they had unfavorable. Still, the average American cannot be blamed for these misperceptions. Media content analysis conducted by a firm in Germany called Media Tenor found that the majority, in many cases, of coverage on Islam is sharply negative in US news media. Americans are bombarded every day with news stories about Muslims and majority Muslim countries in which vocal extremists, not evidence, drive perceptions. If you notice here, the time frame is actually almost exactly between our two measurements, between the last quarter of 2006 and March of 2008. Media Tenor also found that Islam was the most frequently reported on religion in US news media. At the same time, that's what you see in the blue bars. That's the volume of reporting. On the other side is the quality of reporting. Red is negative, yellow is neutral, and green is positive. So if you look at volume times quality, it's clear, it's very easy to see where the negative perception will come from. Media Tenor also found that if we ask the news media who speaks for Islam, 53% of the time would be militants. So the analyst writes, reporting about religious protagonists was rather unbalanced in US news media. While Muslims were frequently associated with militant groups, 53% of the time, 68% of descriptions of Christianity referred to religious organizations or clerics. Now, the issue of militancy, at the heart of the issue of, or the negative perception of Islam, is the issue and the question of violence. And does Islam promote violence? Do Muslims, are they predisposed to supporting violence? So we asked this question. There was a press conference shortly after 9/11, and Donald Rumsfeld was asked, how does the Arab street feel about the attacks? His response was, I don't know. It's not like you can take a Gallup poll. So we did. And here's what we found out. We identified one group, 7% of the global Muslim community, 90% of it that we talked to, who looked distinctly different from the rest. They thought 9/11 was completely justified and had unfavorable opinions of the United States. The reason we broke out this group is because of how dramatically different they looked on other questions. They were far more likely to say sacrificing one's life for a cause one believes in is justified, and far more likely than 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s to say that attacks on civilians in general were justified. And so we broke them out because they clustered out in the data analysis. We wanted to compare them with the residual group. And so the first comparison, the first thing we looked at was religiosity. And our first finding was the lack of a finding. We found no difference between this 7% and the rest in terms of religion being an important part of their daily life. There was no distinguishing power to religiosity in discriminating between the two groups. In a number of countries, we asked a follow-up question after we asked people about 9/11, where we simply asked, why do you say that, after the respondent told us their opinion of 9/11. So if they said it wasn't justified, we said, why do you say that? And if they said it was, we said the same thing, why do you say that? Here's what we heard from the mainstream. They talked about the moral objection to terrorism, that it was the loss of human life, that innocent people who had not committed a crime had been killed, not surprisingly. And some referred to their religious beliefs to talk about that moral objection, saying that God hated murder, sometimes quoting from the Quran verses that talk about the prohibition of killing innocent civilians. What was interesting was that the 7% who said it was completely justified, not a single one of those respondents gave religious justifications. Not one referred to verses from the Quran to justify their position. Instead, they used very secular political justifications, such as America is an imperialist power trying to control the world, accusing America of killing civilians, that this is what they deserve. We also looked at the much broader question of attacks on civilians. Are attacks deliberately targeting civilians? How justified are they? And we asked the American public, and we asked Muslim publics around the world, in many other countries, but I chose the countries that are most associated with militancy in the media: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Lebanon, and found that the American public and Muslim publics around the world were as likely to denounce attacks on civilians as justified. Our studies show that 6% of Americans think the attacks on civilians are completely justified. So that's the group that we identified before in 9/11, the completely justified group. In Saudi Arabia, this figure is 4%. In Lebanon and Iran, it's 2%, which, as you would remember from the beginning, is within our margin of error. In the end, though, the current conflict between the West and the Muslim communities is not inevitable. It is about policy, not a clash about religion or principles. Polls have found that the Lebanese, Christian and Muslim, hold each other in high regard. More than 90% have favorable opinions of each other. Despite a decades-long civil war in Lebanon, fought roughly along confessional lines. Today, less than a generation after the civil rights struggle, a majority of blacks and whites in America say relations between their groups are good. Where in 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of marriage between blacks and whites, today that number is 80%. These hopeful examples underscore the possibility of improving relations between groups, even those with conflicts lasting centuries, and the relative speed by which this is possible. Rather than allow extremists on either side to dictate how we discuss Muslims and the West, we need to instead listen carefully to the voices of ordinary people and thus let facts, not fear, shape our global engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Jessica Rowe. I'm a consultant with the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, and I'm going to moderate the question and answer. And before we invite the audience to pose questions to Ms. Mogahed, which you will do so at the microphone, we have, through Creighton University and the Asian World Center, invited three distinguished individuals who have been prepared questions to pose first to Dalia. And I will introduce them to you and then ask them to speak. Okay. Now first, it is Athman Afwadi, yes, who is the president of the Creighton School, or Saudi Student Association. Yes. Next is Dr. Nasser Al-Sharif, who's associate professor of Pharmacy Sciences. Then there's Professor Michael Kelly from the Law School of Creighton.
My question to you, Dalia, is I'm sure you saw the poll that was released in the New York Times on Sunday about the Arab media. That was conducted by the Kamal Adams Center at the American University of Cairo, and they surveyed 601 journalists in 13 Arab countries. And there were two striking findings, I thought, and I'm just kind of wondering if this tracks your broader findings. Your poll was of the entire Muslim world. Theirs was just a slice of that, the Arab world, and really only a slice of the Arab population, the journalists, which are sort of elites. And I'm sure yours went far deeper than that. But two of the things they found was, with respect to attitudes towards the United States, there was an 89% unfavorable rating toward U.S. policy, but only a 38% unfavorable rating toward the American people. So there was a clear disconnect between Americans and American policy, at least with Arab journalists in the media. And then with respect to America and the Middle East, there was an 83% negative rating for the U.S. role in the Middle East, but only a 46% negative rating for U.S. interference in the region if it leads to benefits. So there was a distinct pragmatism that came out in that poll as well. And granted, this is only Arab journalists and only Arabs within the Muslim world, but does that track your broader findings, or does that dissipate as you move further away from the Arab world into the other parts of the Islamic world?
That trend definitely tracks in terms of the first thing, which is the distinction people make between the U.S. policy and U.S. people. And I'll just tell you a quick story that I always think is fascinating. There was a survey, again, not of everybody, but of young people coming to the United States for an exchange program. And so this was the survey they did before the young people had come to the U.S. It was about 1,000 high school students that were brought over through a State Department program. And they were, and so the survey showed that 90% of them thought Americans were friendly. 90% thought Americans were friendly. And the vast majority had never met an American. I was really perplexed by that, because when you look at our data on the American government, you've got 90% saying it's ruthless, or in some places, or it's not trustworthy, it's aggressive. Only 7% saying it's friendly. So yeah, you've got these dramatically different perceptions of the American people on one hand, the American government on the other, and yet people haven't met a single American. So where are they getting this idea from? And I was talking to a young woman in Egypt last summer, and I asked her this: where are people getting this idea? You know, why aren't they conflating, and you might expect, conflating the American people and the American government? And she said, Friends. I said, what? She said, the show Friends. But it really is true. Even though Hollywood is often accused of doing a lot of negative, it has succeeded in humanizing the American people. And so that is something we see in our data, where there is a big difference between the American policy and the American people. The second piece is a negative role, but 46% vast majority saying that America plays a negative role, but it would be positive if it leads to benefit. And we do find that in that when we ask people, what can the U.S. do to improve relations, or what can the West, we've asked it the West, we've asked it the U.S., and have seen that they're very similar. And basically, we get two kinds of answers. We get the people who say, just leave us alone, and that's all you can do. And then there are people who are slightly more pragmatic who say, actually, we'd like you to maybe transfer some technology. We'd like you to help us with learning more about business expertise, capacity building. Nobody asks for more aid. I mean, absolutely no one asks for aid in general, let alone more aid. They really are very interested in having capacity building and being helped to help themselves, essentially. So when there's a benefit, then many people are very glad to accept American help. But as of now, the idea or the perception is that it's not very beneficial. But if it were, then many people would be very happy to receive that help.
Thank you. I just want to commend the work that was done, and commend also Gallup for taking such a great task. I think for us Muslims and Arabs that have lived in this country, this is a work that validates a lot of what we went through. I do recall as a young pharmacy student going to a presentation by the State Department representative to the Middle East, and that was in 1983, and I asked the question, is there going to be a time when our country, well, at that time I wasn't an American citizen, that this country will associate itself with the aspiration of the people of that part of the world rather than corrupt leaders in that part of the world? And that was in 1982, and I wasn't even that savvy about politics and so on. And I asked that question, and I didn't even know about the doctrine, the Bush doctrine and democracy and all that stuff that we hear now. So this concept really is in the minds of people in that part of the world, not from this survey. It's been around for a long, long time. For me, being here and kind of getting more involved in activism and so on, looking at the Omaha World Herald and covering the Arab Muslim world, and for a year and a half trying to publish in the Public Pulse or editorials and so on, looking at the international page and looking at the images from the Arab world, just the coverage in terms of the headlines being all negative, being all violent, the pictures of kids with guns and so on, which is completely different than what I'm used to, my great-grandparents, grandparents, and so on that lived in that part of the world and how they live. And I always compare them to the Huxtables and the Waltons of this country, but sadly enough, they're not represented in the media as such, so, which is very sad, very unfortunate. And certainly as a faculty member traveling from 1995 to up to last year and presenting at institutions from Kuwait to Jordan to Egypt to Palestine, I don't recall one single ordinary, and I love that concept, ordinary people in that part of the world saying anything negative about this country. On the contrary, a lot of the sentiments in terms of the questions were the sentiments that I heard from professionals to ordinary people in Jerusalem talking about how hard their life is, but still acknowledging that America can improve their life and America is the one that can help them, in the occupation or whatever. So I don't recall anything in terms of people saying we hate America or we hate their way of life. On the contrary, they appreciate and admire our way of life and, yes, the liberty and so on, what we have in this country. So it's a validation really for what I went through in this country. And I would say in terms of 2001, I always had my statistical analysis as a scientist. The largest I heard in terms of the camps in Afghanistan is about 10,000, 15,000 of bin Laden followers. Multiply that by 10 or 15, that's 1.5 million. That's about 0.1% of the 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. So we all try to struggle with how can we explain that part of the world in terms of the ordinary people and our ways living in this country. So I really do appreciate this work in terms of, especially with the association with Gallup, and hopefully it will make a difference. I guess my question is relating to the future. We do have an election in this country. I don't know what extent, the Bush administration will be impacted by such kind of work with kind of the message that we got for the last 8 years. What is the hope with this kind of work with an Obama, a Clinton, or a McCain, and what kind of work is being done to educate people that are coming, especially in this country? I don't want to talk about Europe, but can you give us some idea in terms of how can these be used, this kind of work, to help the future in terms of the tours and who is going to be the leader of this particular country? Thank you.
We're doing a number of things, as Anne mentioned, as a part of our Muslim West Facts initiative, to get this information out to leaders because of the belief that Dr. Gallup had that the wisdom of the people is something that helps leaders make better decisions. And so we've sent a copy of our book to every member of Congress, and we've briefed and talked to, engaged, and met with several leaders in Washington and outside of Washington. And we are working to meet with each of the campaigns.
Hi. I have a question. As a Muslim from Saudi Arabia, I came to this country 2 years ago, and I came prior to 9/11 as well. I was here in 95 and in 99. This book meticulously breaks all the stereotype of Muslims. When I read the book, I always write a note, and I flip to the second page or the second chapter. I have my note being answered or my question being answered. Really, this book helped me understand my Muslim brother as well. I was surprised sometimes, and I was happy most of the times. A Muslim usually here being presented in the media most of the time is like an angry mob marching in the street and burning flags, which is really happening in the reality. The fact that Muslims like technology and like want to be under the democratic government as well, this makes the saying that they hate our life, or they hate our way of lives, as credible as mission accomplished. So it's only media talk. I mean, all media talk. It's not something that really on the ground. My question is, most of the positive signs from Muslim population, they like democracy, and they want to have technology, and they admire a lot about the West. Those people, the same people, they are not as powerful as the American citizen. So American citizens, they have access to power. They can change. The rest of the world, especially Muslim and Arab, they don't have as power as the Americans because they are under undemocratic governments, most of them. So what's the hope message and what's the situation? Because here we see people are hopeful but are powerless. That's in the Muslim world. And here we have people less hopeful and more powerful. So how we balance things out, how we progress from here on out. And thank you.
I think you ask a very good and important question. I'll talk a little bit about the idea of really an informed democracy, because we do have the power to elect our own leaders here in the United States. That power comes with a great deal of responsibility, of course. And that responsibility is just simply to be well informed. So I would say that I think the future is that Americans are, according to our research, very interested and hungry for information. And we hope that this research does inform people as they make decisions about their political choices.
Thank you for coming to meet with us today. In one of your most recent answers, you mentioned that some of the respondents indicated that they really didn't want any help at all, or perhaps help in the guise of technology. I'm interested, rather than with the broad word help, ways of demonstrating respect. From this, and certainly from some of your slides, it indicates that whether someone was considered a radical or considered mainstream, what came out as the most important priority was for the West, or specifically the United States, to demonstrate respect. So then did your researchers give participants an opportunity, either open-ended or by ranking, of specific ways that respect can be demonstrated?
That's a very good question. That is our follow-up research, and we're in the field right now with that exact question of what does respect mean? How does one demonstrate respect? From just the data we've gathered thus far, what we find is that the issue of respect comes from two things: how our leaders or the representatives of the United States talk, and how they treat Muslims, or at least how they're perceived to treat Muslims. Here's a fundamental principle. If you admire someone and think that they stand for admirable values, and then that same person is perceived to treat you in a very less than admirable way, then that will be perceived as more of a type of prejudice or disrespect than if you simply didn't respect or admire that person and that person treats everybody badly. So it's kind of the difference between a dictatorial government, which might do much of the same, and the reaction that people had when the United States, say, when the pictures of Abu Ghraib were released. So one U.S. diplomat told me that when she was in Egypt, and she was actually in Egypt when the whole thing broke, that people would tell her, "We expect this from our government, but not from you." And so it is actually because we've set the bar somewhat high that this whole issue of respect comes out, because of this disconnect between values and the way people are perceived to be treated.
Bob Robeson, just a citizen. You showed a viewgraph on what the American TV was, where the impressions come from the Muslim world. Where do the majority of the people receive their information that is if people feel that America is good and 90% of the people like Americans, where are they getting where the 90 or 80% dislike? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think I know what you're saying. You're asking, where are people getting their information about America, and how does their media content look? Is that it?
Yes. Is Al Jazeera, or is it newspapers, or?
Yes, okay. Yes, that makes sense. Well, Al Jazeera is the most viewed TV station TV news satellite station in the Arab world. So it's an Arabic station, so it's viewed by Arabs. And they also have an English station that's viewed much wider. But if we focus on the Arabic station, it's the most viewed. And we found two interesting findings. One, that TV portrayals of America all over the world, actually, not even just in the Muslim world, is negative right now. We also found that Al Jazeera, even though it does have negative portrayals of America, has neutral portrayals of Christianity. So if we look at the comparable thing. But that when we look at people who have positive opinions of the US and compare them to people with negative opinions of the US, those two groups are as likely to watch Al Jazeera on a weekly basis. So watching Al Jazeera, actually, there was no difference between those two groups. So a lot of studies have shown that simply watching Al Jazeera is not enough to make someone have anti-American sentiment. But that there are, other things, their interpretation of the news. But that said, it is still a very negative portrayal of the U.S.
And is that likewise in newspapers and magazines and others?
Yes, the media content analysis did look at print media as well. Yes.
Do you have that in your book? Or is that
No, we
study-
didn't put
that's
media
not-
content in the book. We
That's
just
not part of the survey.
No, it's not. It's from Media Tenor. It's a different organization entirely.
Assalamu alaikum, sister. My name is Bilal Khalik. Mashallah, I want to commend you and congratulate you, the organization and yourself, for doing such great research. Just like Al Gore put out The Inconvenient Truth, and it was a movie version, went in all the cinemas, movie theaters. Do you have any plans of putting this in a different format besides a book that could be shown in maybe in an hour or so? And also, just as a local Muslim resident, what can we use from this book or a presentation, things like that, to inform our neighbors and the people that we associate with?
Great. We are actually planning on making a documentary about the book, so that's in the works. The other thing is that we are also planning on creating a PowerPoint compendium to the book so that it can be used by educators or community organizations. And that hopefully should be, inshallah, finished by the end of the summer. And so those are the kinds of things you can use. And our website has short briefs that people can just read quickly, lots of short articles. Our website, if you're interested, is MuslimWestFacts.com.
Okay. And Gallup being a for-profit organization, is there any copyright issues if we do use some of those surveys or facts?
No, there isn't. Not if it's on the website. Then it's free to the public. Thank you.
My name is Jeff Smith, and I'd just like to ask a research-related question and then a question that has an historical component to it. Taking into account the distinction that you said Muslim people made between U.S. policy and its people, I'm left wondering what was the age of the participants in the study, especially related to militancy and the ruthlessness of our federal government and the hostility that comes along with that, because historically the British is the only country where it's ever been said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and so they have actually been the country who's probably done more as it relates to colonization, or ruthless colonization, and the fact of the matter is that the U.S. government isn't even comparable in scope or purpose for the actions that they've taken as a government. And so I'm wondering what's the age of the participants, because my sense is that probably older Muslims might remember what the British did throughout the Middle East, where maybe the younger ones would not.
Okay, good, thank you. The age range was, really losing my voice, I'm sorry. 15 and older. 15 and older that was the age range that we interviewed. And we interviewed them based on their population percentage. So in countries where The majority are young people. Our data, our sample is majority young people, so it represents the demographics of the country. And we found that in general, not just among Muslims, but in general, that young people are more likely than older people to fall in that radical category. And they are more angry, and they are more frustrated. So that's what we found. Thank you.
Dick DeLucia. One of the things is I read in the survey here that you have, and my understanding that, of course, I don't have the real knowledge of the Quran because I have not read that much of it. But I'd like to have your opinion when they talk about the third model in which religion principles and democracy values coexist. They want their own democratic model that draws on Islamic law as a source. And of course, relating back to the media in terms of the Quran and things, many of us may have different views of what is there. Would you talk a little bit about this third model?
Sure. I'll start by actually giving you what I think was surprising data about Americans. So we asked that question of Americans. Now, we didn't say Sharia, we said the Bible. But we asked the same question: do you think the Bible should be the only source of legislation, a source but not the only source, or not a source of legislation? And we found that 57% of Americans think the Bible should be a source of legislation. 9% of them think it should be the only source. So there's a whole negotiating of religion and democracy right here in the United States. And so there's all kinds of interpretations of what democracy means looking across the West. Democracy in the United States looks very different than Britain, looks very different than France, and so on. So there isn't just one model that I can point to and say Muslims want this. What we have found is when we ask people, what does Sharia mean to you? What does Sharia compliance actually mean to you? It's a very loaded word. And when you look at the data, essentially Sharia compliance is the rule of law. It's a law that no one is above. It's a law that is not subject to the whim of a tyrant because it's from God. And so it limits the power of government. When we ask about specific things, do you associate Sharia with empowerment of women or justice for women or cruelty to women? So we ask all kinds of questions about what does Sharia actually mean? And what we come out with is it really, to people, what they hear when they hear that word, they're not thinking about cruel punishments necessarily. They're thinking about social justice. So I think it's important to get an understanding of from Muslim eyes, and that's what's really important since they're the ones that are going to be living with it, what does that word mean to them according to the research? Hopefully that sheds some light. I'm starting to totally lose.
I'm a student here right now at UNO. I guess...
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Mike Powell, a student here. It was interesting to see in your study that you were able to finally determine a true grasp of the magnitude of the portion you cut out as the more extremist group, the 7% that justified the attacks of September 11th. That's compared with the 92%, I believe, that would be the rest of the Muslim community. Because of obviously the media focus on this group, I think that it's obviously an important part that's highlighted itself as a need to start to clear up the I guess what's actually happening in the true beliefs of the Muslim population as compared with the U.S. versus the media coverage, which we've shown to be not accurate. Did you in your studies have any sort of polling or research of the other 92% of the Muslim population and their perspective on the 7%, the extremists?
Yes. We asked everybody the same questions, but that's a very good point. I'll give you some examples of what we found. We asked people to tell us their greatest fear for their country, or their greatest fear. And the most frequent response among the mainstream was issues of personal security, including being actually a victim of terrorism. People actually talked about that. And it's not surprising because Muslims are the primary victims of terrorism. We also found that when we asked people, what can the Muslim world do to improve relations with the West, the other way, the most frequent response was to control extremism. So that's what the general public feels about extremists. And we also asked the general question how people feel about attacks deliberately to target civilians. And you saw the data of how people responded to that question.
I'm Jenny Zealand. I'm a student here at Creighton University, and I want to thank you for coming. And your study of Tanzania is mind-blowing for the random sample. I'm just completely blown away with the results that you got. That is, you should be very proud of yourself. But okay, we're running out of time. And anyways, everybody's asked my questions, kind of, so I'll try to sum it up. What were your numbers? I couldn't really see your numbers because I was back there. What was your random sample for Americans?
Okay.
That's not my question. Can I ask more than that?
Okay.
That's a lame question.
Sure,
that just to begin with, just because like we had the random sampling for the Islam or the Muslims, you know what I'm saying? Because I didn't get a number for how many were in the random sample for the people that you asked for the Americans. There
was 1,000 people in each country randomly selected.
Okay,
yes.
That's what the sample group was for each.
Right.
Okay. Basically, what I noticed was, you know, I just find it so flabbergasting, the results that you got based on the fact that the favorable response of Muslims for the Americans, like wanting to adopt Western progress, you know, it would not necessarily be helpful for the East, but they want better relations. It kind of goes against Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, is what went through my head. But basically, it's kind of like they want global help, but they don't want us to come in and take over.
Right.
And obviously, which everybody knows, but that seems to be the problem, and we can't get that through our heads. Is there a way in your book that can help sort of help us work together and not just come in and like take over, in the sense of, I'm hurrying and now I'm nervous. The Joint Force is working on an effort to understand Islam, but just not, okay, because there's Al Jazeera that's doing their thing, there's our news networks that are doing our thing. How do you regulate that? Like, we're, like, through blogging, you know, like, is it up to the individual to you know what I'm saying? Because everybody's going to do whatever they want.
Right.
How do you stop the kind of freight train that's already going with people's own ideologies? You know, like, just as a matter of fact, just, you know, Barack Obama last weekend, this woman in West Virginia says, I'm tired of this Hussein thing. And that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with here. How do you get through that?
That's not an easy question.
Well, I understand that, you know, and,
Sure.
and it's just, it's kind of like, you know, obviously we have ideas, you have books, you know, I have papers, but it's like, how do you just keep talking and breaking down just barriers? Or
No, I think
do you do
that's
it individually, or do you just try to like have groups, or
I think there's a lot of things we can do. First of all, and I'll just focus on us here in the United States because that's who's here. So I'll just focus on us. There's a lot of things we don't have to feel helpless about the media. We're the consumers of the media. We are their customers.
But I feel like they're lying to us all
Well,
the time.
we need to demand better quality. we need to demand it. And
out
if we
there,
do,
we have to go get it.
so we have to just demand more and better things from our media and from our representatives. That's one thing. I go through in the women's chapter some recommendations on how can Western advocates for Muslim women approach the issue in a more constructive way than taking over, just like your question.
Right.
So there's some recommendations in that might be helpful.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Muhammad Al-Hajj from Crete University, and I have experience, want to share you about that, about this topic, Islam and West. Actually, from my experience now, I have been in the United States for almost 3 years. I am Crete University student. I feel like I'm in my home country. About the populations, about, everything. I got all my rights. I have mosque to pray. I got everything. And also, I have experience in my country, for ordinary people, everybody friendly. But also, what is this coming from? Also from the book, I'm a Muslim. The Quran, forbid for people to violence against religious and against, others without any reason.
Do you have a question for Dalia? Could you ask?
Yeah. Also, my questions here, my point, is this problem between people who want to control the power in the Middle East and those people, historically, I know, or everybody know, have relationship with American leaders. So what do you think now? This problem, Osama bin Laden and his group, and now the war or leaders here want to fight and and direct the medias. All this, I totally believe that this is just between those people who want to control the power in Middle East and those people who are, before they are trained and they know what they're going to do and they just want to control them. I don't know. I guess this is simple like this. What do you think? Thank you.
Well, what I hear from your question or your comment is that it's kind of a battle between two extremes, and it's a battle of about power between two extremes. And I guess I just go back to it really is the premise of our book is that we only do hear from a very small fringe, a vocal fringe on both sides, and the views of the rest of the population, the vast majority, who tell us that they reject both extremes, are silenced. And we really use that word very deliberately because the vast majority, they're not silent, they're silenced. They're silenced by media that ignores them. They're silenced by vocal extremists that out-yell, just like me, I can't even talk. Just have louder voices. And so it is important that we do start to get a more scientific, more representative view of what's really going on. And I think that's the first step to solving the problem.
Patrick Murray, I teach here at Creighton. I wonder what it says about the formation of opinion in the U.S. about Arab and Muslim people, that in the wake of 9/11, it seemed to me there was really no public outcry against Saudi Arabia, even though most of the perpetrators were Saudi, bin Laden Saudi. There was also seemed to be almost no reaction to one of the early consequences of the Iraq War, which was that Saudi Arabia sent the U.S. military forces out of Saudi Arabia, which seemed to be one of the leading demands of bin Laden and al-Qaeda, as I understand it. This seemed to be just not registered. So what does it say about the formation? I mean, you emphasize the differentials in how Muslims look at different Western countries. But what do these things say about the formation of opinion by people in the U.S. about Arabs and Muslims?
Well, I guess I'll just start by what we know about American opinion of different countries. And the most negatively viewed countries by Americans are North Korea, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, actually. And I think it is because of, and I do think Saudi Arabia is quite, I mean, I don't think this is even, it's not very easy it's not very easy to miss. Saudi Arabia is pretty demonized in the media. I don't think I've ever heard anything positive about Saudi Arabia in our media. And it is among the most negatively viewed countries in the world for Americans: Iran, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. And I don't have a comment about how the Saudi government kicked out the troops with the invasion of Iraq. The issue, of course, was the justification for having troops there was the threat that Saddam Hussein presented the kingdom. And when he was gone, they figured, well, the reason for the troops is no longer needed. And so they got rid of the troops. So that's, I guess, my response to why that happened. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.